How Easy You Are to Need by Delimeful. Warning for graphic descriptions of violence, mild blood, minor violence, bears, the animal kind, not the gay kind, misunderstandings, suicidal thoughts, self-hatred, codependency, and angst with a happy ending. Chapter 1. Winter. When the humans showed up, it was winter. It took Virgil a shamefully long amount of time to realize, wondering about the odd scent on the breeze until he passed the abandoned house on the edge of his territory. It was a small but well-built cabin, one that he'd attempted to shelter in during past winters before realizing that it was laced with supernatural deterrents. He'd dismissed it as an old hunter hideout, seeing as it hadn't been touched in years. Naturally, it was now lit from within, a wisp of gray smoke curling from the chimney. Virgil moaned lowly, already tired of the situation. Winters were always hard, and this one especially so. He could already envision any number of possible catastrophes that could result from confronting the trespassers in his weakened and vaguely malnourished state. He turned away, stalking back into the woods. It wasn't worth the trouble. A week later, he found himself stumbling into the clearing, half dead with cold. It hadn't been planned. He'd been struggling to keep moving, keep the blood pumping within him, knowing that stopping in such a heavy storm meant he would never get back up. He'd underestimated the season, and now he was paying the price. The lights of the cabin caught his eye, a distant warmth, and he wandered towards it with a limping gait. Getting seen by humans might just mean a more merciful death at this point. He looked like a normal wolf, if a bit oversized, so they probably wouldn't be able to tell he was a shifter, right? He paused at the edge of a halo of light cast out by the window, nervous, but he could already feel the warmth emanating from the house. He slunk closer, circling the house until he found the vent opening to the crawlspace. Hunters were paranoid, always keeping unexpected escape routes built into their hideouts. He braced himself and then shifted with low cracks of bone and flesh. This close to the full moon, it ached like sore muscles, but not as bad as the cold stung at his now human body. Gritting his teeth, he quickly dug his nails into the wood surrounding the metal grate and tore it out, ignoring the splinters he surely now had. Task done, he shifted back as quick as he could and waited for an agonizing moment, listening for any signs that he'd been heard. Nothing. Satisfied, Virgil belly crawled into the space under the house, just barely managing to fit at his height. From there, it was just a matter of finding the warmest spot and recovering for a few hours. Thankfully, the floor space extended to where the fireplace crackled merrily. Unfortunately, the occupants of the house were seated in the same room, and his acute hearing in this form meant that he could hear their conversations loud and clear. He sighed lowly and settled in, struggling to ignore their chatter. And chatter they did. Over the course of the next few hours, he managed to discern each human's name and identify which one was talking based on dialogue alone. There were 3 of them, unless they had a 4th mute roommate who they never acknowledged. The first, and loudest, was Roman. He spoke arrogantly, full of bravado and thrilling tales of daring do, like a pampered prince on a white horse. Virgil couldn't help but huff occasionally, certain that certain aspects were exaggerated, but his nicknames for the others were a riot. Since the others seemed less keen on returning fire, Virgil vowed to mentally dub him Princey. The second was Patton. He was the friendly type, fondness for the other 2 clear in his voice every time he made a bad joke at them. The gaps in the stories were always filled by his various noises of reaction, gasping and humming at all the right parts. He even occasionally commented on the cruelty or kindness of a certain act, regardless of if the hero or the villain was the one committing it. The third, and by comparison the quietest, was Logan. He kept his voice so measured that sometimes Virgil had to strain to hear it. And he did because Logan's commentary was always either rather informative or brutally popping Princey's bubble. His words were often blunt, but the way he delivered them made Virgil think that he didn't really intend to be rude, he was just honest. They must have known each other for a long time, because there was little abrasion in the way they poked fun or chimed in to stories they had been present for. It was a sort of easy camaraderie, the kind that Virgil never had as a literal lone wolf. He wondered absently if humans had packs. Maybe he would have had one if he hadn't been turned. Somewhat melancholy, he curled up and tucked his head against his paws, dozing to the sound of the idle conversation above him. When he woke, the storm had finally settled into a light drift of snow, and the house above him was quiet and still, the heat faded. He lay there for a long moment with chill in his bones, considering breaking into the house and getting rid of the intruders while they lay vulnerable. They were only 3, and in his current state the odds were in his favor. He should just be done with it. Humans ended up a threat, always. Instead, he crawled out and made his way silently back into the woods to hunt. It was too troublesome to kill them, that was all. Being a lone wolf suited him, he reflected as he returned to the cabin the next night, because if he had packmates they would surely tease him relentlessly for being so soft. Still, the sounds of the humans above and the warmth of their hearth made sleeping easier than it had been in ages, and with a clear head hunting became easier. He figured that alone was reason enough to allow them to remain here, even if only for the season. It didn't have anything to do with the fondness they spoke to each other with, or the lack of harshness he'd come to expect from humans. Nothing at all. After all, he knew that even if they were kind to each other, such a courtesy wouldn't be extended to him. He was familiar with the routine. The moment one of them spotted him, the tenuous peace would shatter, and they'd be after him, vicious and cunning as humans always were. It had been that way back when he was a pup, too small to be a threat, and he wasn't fool enough to think things would change when he was a full-grown wolf. That didn't mean he couldn't take advantage of their presence until then, though, and he found that with each day he learned more about the trio. Patton loved to bake, but would often get distracted if drawn into conversation by one of the others, going by the burnt smell he woke up to on more than one occasion. Roman sometimes stayed up later than the others, unusually quiet, apart from the constant, frantic scratching of pen on paper. Logan seemed to love the stars, Virgil thought, as he returned one evening to find the cabin lights off and the 3 of them laying down on a blanket under the sky. They were silhouettes in the dark, and he didn't dare get close enough to see them properly. But he could hear Logan's voice, reciting tales of his own for once as he pointed out constellations. He was sorely tempted to lay down at the edge of the woods, fall asleep to those sounds he'd been listening to for weeks now, but these humans were so exposed, out of their protected house, flat on their backs. Virgil couldn't even tell if they had weapons with them. In the middle of monster territory, it was a dangerous move. It was just for the warmth, he told himself as he began patrolling the area around the house, scaring off anything that came in range and leaving furrows in the trees to warn that the space was his. The humans didn't have anything to do with it. He held on to this assertion even when the snow began to melt, when he followed Roman from a distance when he went out to hunt, when he stood guard over Patton as he began to till the earth for a garden, when he sat under the stars with Logan and made sure nothing disturbed him. The humans didn't affect him at all, until he found himself the only thing between them and the overgrown magic-sick grizzly outside their home. "Is that a wolf?" Roman cried out behind him, as he snapped and snarled at the bear, hackles raised. It was stupid to try and take it down without a pack, especially with the crystals growing from its back and the wild, rabid look in its eyes. Normally he'd be running to find the highest ground until it got tired and left, especially so close to the new moon, but behind him, Patton whimpered, and he felt another surge of anger at the sound. His scream had been the only thing that called him here in the first place, and he'd still been too late to keep the grizzly from taking a swipe at the human's leg before he rammed right into it. He chanced to look over his shoulder, seeing Logan pressing cloth to the injury with one hand and winding Patton's arm around his shoulders with the other. Roman had an enchanted blade out, alarm written all over his face, and he wavered as though he wasn't sure who was the bigger danger. At least he hadn't figured out Virgil was a shifter yet. The momentary lapse cost him, and he took a swing from one of those huge paws head-on. Spots dotted his vision as he was knocked to the side, and he forced himself back to his feet, ignoring the way something seemed to have snapped on his right side. The bear was ignoring him now, small beady eyes back on the 3 humans, and Virgil felt an unprecedented protectiveness flare up in him. A growl building in his chest, he dove for the bear's neck, latching on and tearing at its chest with his hind legs. It rose up on 2 legs, baying and clawing, but Virgil continued to tear at its throat until a particularly harsh shake threw him off. He could taste blood in his mouth, but rolled right back up, adrenaline muting all his pain, and let out an unearthly howl as he moved between the bear and the humans once more. The grizzly hadn't come away without damage either, though, and its breaths came out rasping and wet. It seemed to suddenly decide that the reward wasn't worth the risk, as it gave one last growl before turning and going in search of easier things to kill. In Virgil's forest. Shit, Virgil thought, his form trembling with exhaustion. I should go deal with that. He managed a few shaking steps forward before collapsing, and as if to make everything perfectly worse, his wolf form slipped away like water through his fingers. He struggled to push himself back up, his mind screaming that he was going to be killed, but everything was so heavy and unresponsive. A glint of light caught his eye, and he turned his head slightly to see Roman a few paces away, sword still in hand. A throaty moan left him, more animal than human, and he let his head drop, craning his neck to look out at the forest. If he was going to be killed, he didn't want to be looking at the damn human who did it. A footstep crunched behind him, and then the last of his adrenaline drained away, and the pain hit, dragging him into blissful unconsciousness.